somewhere. All right. We left out one detail, and that was the microphone. Thanks for having me, John Schusler, Lynn Simpson, and the great staff here. A lot of people ask me when I do these symposiums, which has only been a few, why Aztec? Why would anybody pick that one? That's been a very hot and highly debated topic over the years. I think the reason I picked this one, I'll be going on my 19th year now of research on it. I went back and we looked at it, and we really saw that nobody had ever properly done a good investigation on it. We're going to go through a little bit of the history today and give you some background, because most people don't even remember what happened or the story behind Aztec. Start first with our first overhead. If we could zoom that out a little bit. Kind of just an overview of what we're going to do today. We're having overhead problems back there, so bear with us. Basically, we'll look at the original story as written by Frank Scully in his book that came out in 1950. Testimony, we're going to modify that a little bit more than just told by locals from that era. We're going to expand on that. And we're going to compare the claims made by Frank Scully with our research almost 58 years later. Research gathering, that's really now up to, we've gone to about 31 states, interviewed probably 68 people. Most of our backup documentation on this is going back now, like I said, almost 58 years later, and declassifying military records, Air Force, Atomic Energy Commission, FBI. And to show we're serious on it, if we could slide that overhead up just a little bit. Maybe not. A little bit up. There we go. We've quit really keeping track, but in about 16 of the 18 and a half years, we spent over $200,000. And that's a lot of out-of-pocket expense bouncing around the country, but that's what we had to do to really get into the teeth of it. I'll get into the story. I'll give you a condensed version of Frank Scully's original story, just to give you some background on the crash. But first, if we go to the next slide, I'll give you a background of what that territory looked like today, the terrain of the crash site. We could turn that about 90 degrees. There we go. Raise it up a little bit to where the X would be right in the middle. There we go. Great, that's fantastic. Okay, the X does, in this case, mark the spot. Hart Canyon Road runs east off of what is now Highway 550. Hart Canyon Road does a bend, which is called the Arkansas Loop or the Arkansas Bend. It's an old landmark out there. The X is about the epicenter of the alleged crash site. As you can see, that terrain is very, very sparse today as it was 58 years ago. There's a few oil drip tanks and a few oil drilling rigs out there. The crash site's about 12 and a half miles from the downtown of Aztec, New Mexico. Even if you don't have an interest in looking at the Aztec case, if you ever wanted just a fun weekend, Aztec is a beautiful little town. Great people. So you can see it's sparse today, you can imagine, and thank you, Stan, I appreciate that. Let's see if I can operate it now. There we go. It was very sparse back then as it is today. Very little has changed. The drip tanks were removed about 8 years ago. Those were the little dots in front of the X. The road's changed a little bit. Now we'll go on to the original story. If we could have the next slide, please. That's the man who started it all. That's a very young Frank Scully from back in that time frame. Frank was a very well-known writer, freelance writer. Lived in New York until about the mid to late 40s, moved to California. He ran with a pretty impressive crowd back then. Bruce Cabot, the actor, Beverly Marley, famous director, producer, Linda Darnell, famous actress, of course Silas Newton, who broke this UFO story to Frank Scully. Frank was approached by Silas Newton in 1949 at the Hollywood Country Club, and Silas said, "Frank, I've got a story that a friend of mine has that needs to be broken. They want somebody like you to break the story." Frank pondered on it for a few days. Finally, he met with Bruce Cabot, Linda Darnell, Beverly Marley, just to give some credibility to Silas Newton. Silas Newton was an oil speculator who had, matter of fact, he had his office right here in Denver, Colorado, as well as New York, New Jersey, New Mexico, and California. One of the jokes Frank Scully used to say about Silas Newton is he never made more than $25 million a year or lost more than $25 million a year. That's the oil speculation business. Well, anyway, Silas Newton introduces Frank Scully to a mystery man by the name of Dr. G, who Frank Scully later said was a composite of 8 to 9 scientists. Dr. G informs Frank Scully that in 1948 he worked on the recovery of a crashed or soft-landed UFO on a mesa in New Mexico, right outside the town of Aztec, New Mexico. He goes on in great detail to describe what they found, how long the recovery took, and basically the who's who of the world of science that worked on it. Frank came out with his book in 1950. It was called Behind the Flying Saucers. Some of the vendors here can find it on the internet for you or order it for you. And the book was an amazing success. The best I can track, it sold 64,000 copies in the first 18 months. It was the first hardback book ever written on a UFO episode. Donald Kehoe had a book come out the year before in paperback form. And it was at a time where the American public and the rest of the world was really yearning to learn more about UFOs. I read the book with great interest, did some research after I heard about the story. And I kind of figured, well, I'm going to be going out to the Four Corners area every 6 or 8 months. Maybe I'll look into it, give it 6 months, and I'll have it all figured out. That was 19 years ago. But we're not even halfway there, if there is such a thing as a halfway point. So we decided to do our research. We thought we'd take the original story and pick it apart piece by piece. We'd look at what the skeptics had to say. We'd look at what was going on in the world of science at that time. Over the years, Aztec has had more than one black eye. There's been 2 books written on it. One I see here floating around, The UFO Crash at Aztec. It came out in the late 80s by Bill Steinman and Wendell Stevens. And everybody's done a little bit of research, so we've tried to really dig in and do a lot of research. Both in Behind the Flying Saucers, written by Frank Scully, this mystery Dr. G makes some pretty horrendous claims for back in 1950. And one of the areas that we decided to look at first were the original claims that he made, that they tracked this errant flying disc with some secret radar bases up in the Four Corners area or possibly southern Colorado. So we thought the first thing we'll do, the easiest thing we thought, is dig in and try to find the old radar bases. Next slide, please. That's the radar bases that don't exist. That's sort of one of many panoramic shots we took. We found the bases in January of 1999. The morning we got up there was about 2 or 3 feet of snow. We came back in May when it was starting to green up a little bit. And I guess I jumped ahead a little bit. Before we even went on this expedition, we went to the Air Force and tried to account for all the radar bases in that era, and they had none. So we went out with topographic maps trying to plot where, if we were going to put a radar base back then, where we'd put one. That's up on a high mountain range. That's about 9 miles, maybe 8.5 miles due west-southwest of Chalma, New Mexico. Next slide, please. That's more of it. Basically, what was left, a lot of barracks, the officers' club, the infirmary, the main office, the radar bunker, the power station, which was a backup power, gymnasium, and it was just like they just up and left, even some furniture left behind. So we went back to Maxwell Air Force Base, which is the archives of all the military, all the Air Force locations, presented them with the pictures and said, hey, we really need your help. This is the one you can't find. And I really believe it was an innocent oversight, because there had been a lot of confusion. These bases, as we will go into it in a minute, were operated by other people, so there were records sort of stashed away in other areas. So at this point, we thought maybe the mystery Dr. G had a feather in his cap. You know, we found one of them. Next slide, please. Part of the problem, this is, I think the date on that is 1952. It's the clearest one I have. You can see Gonzales, the Alvado, Moriarty, and of course Kirkland, and then a radar site they called Roswell. It wasn't really in Roswell. Ironically, it was in the town of Corona. Going back, when we got these all declassified, we realized we had a problem. The Air Force didn't take over these bases until 1950. Well, if Aztec happened in 1948, that wouldn't work well with the timeline. Next slide, please. So we sat there one night reading the capital expenditure report from 1950, and we found out they were asking for things like a new roof on the officers' club, a few new hot water heaters, and some transformers they wanted to order, really powerful step-up transformers from the RE Optograph Company in Scottsdale, Pennsylvania. So I went back to the Air Force and I said, if this is a new base, why are you ordering a new roof, new transformers? So we did some more digging, and we found out that they were operated by the Atomic Energy Commission. And that's the cover of the historical report. Their main object in life was to protect Kirkland, of course, Los Alamos, and Sandia National Labs, all part of the air defense at that time, plus the Manhattan Project. So then we had our feather in Dr. G's hat, so to speak, that in fact they did exist. And further irony, Dr. G always referred to these as the Los Alamos radar site. It was first called Los Alamos radar site, then the Tia Maria, and then later in life, the Alvado. So we started to see things pieced together, plus we actually had great pains to declassify all this in 1999. We interviewed people in the town of Chalma, Tia Maria. They knew there was some type of facility down there, but if Dr. G knew about these as he's breaking the story to Frank Scully, he had to be somebody that was in the loop, because these bases were very classified. Next slide, please. We noticed as we dug into the radar bases, we got the historical and monthly reports. By the way, my wife and I have I don't know what the count is now, 2,600 documents. She moves them around, she'd probably know better. We noticed every month they're doing their typical duty roster reports, injury reports, and we noticed in one of the table of contents a UFO report. And this is an organizational manning chart of the 4602 AISS, Air Intelligence Service Squadron, which is just down the road here at Ent Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. So we noticed that the radar sites are doing all their good UFO reports. They're not going to Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio. They're going to this group. excuse me, I did a little research, and it turned out that Donald Kehoe had used their name in his paperback book, suspecting that UFO reports were going to these guys. And then after that, it just dropped off. I went back and looked at what the critics had to say about Donald Kehoe back in the 50s, late 40s. And some of the critics said, oh, the 4602, 7 to 9 people in that group, and they're going to be phased out. That'll all go to Wright-Patterson. If we could put that slide up one more time. That's a little bit more than 7 to 9 people. We counted once, I forget how many, it's 273, I think, if you count everybody. So, again, we're creeping along, and there's a little bit more and more credibility from Frank Scully's book. We have to use that as a timeline and a benchmark, because in looking at it, and of course I couldn't talk to Frank Scully, he's long passed away, but it just seemed like whoever was leaking the story to Frank Scully back then had some good information. Next slide, please. This is, again, we had these declassified. Some of these are the first time anybody's seen these, unless you're at Aztec this year. Now we have the Project Blue Book operating out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And it's funny, in their historical report, they make fun of them, reminding all the radar bases that the good reports come up to us at the 4602. All the other ones go to Wright-Patterson. This is right in their mission statement. I'll send a copy to anybody that wants it. Because Project Blue Book is nothing more than a publicity campaign. But over the years, we've seen the unknowns that Project Blue Book had. Look at the bottom, if you can read that. They had a worse success rate than Project Blue Book as far as knowns and unknowns. And these were the cream of the crop. I mean, these were the high Air Force intelligence people. I think it's 17% if my math is right. So all the good military reports, all the good radar tracking sites from all these AC&W, which is aircraft control and warning, that are going up to the 4602, it might be 18%, 16, but it's around 17% they couldn't account for. Next slide, please. Some of these are hard to read, and I apologize. They're copies of documents that are 58 years old, right off the originals. By the 50s and going all the way up to 57, I think this is dated 1951 or 2, gives you an idea of the AC&W facilities we had across the country. So obviously the 4602 is getting lots of good, qualified UFO reports. Matter of fact, each file would be about that thick a year. You can see the ones in New Mexico, the one down at Corona, and the one near Deming, New Mexico, which, and again, these, by 1957, most of these, not all of them, but most of them were rendered useless due to new technologies. Next slide, please. And again, what we're doing is we're going along to about the halfway point. We're going to just establish credibility in what Frank had in his original evaluation of, and his book. One of the theories over the years, and I'm not sure if I subscribe to it or not, but what brought the craft down near Aztec, New Mexico? Bill Steinman, who he and Wendell self-published their book in the late 80s, Bill Steinman came up with a theory after interviewing people that these bases, if they could ever find them, had some very high powerful radar, experimental radar. Well, it turns out the one in Alvarado, the original Los Alamos base, was experimenting with some extremely powerful radar. Some people refer to it as lash up. That's not really a correct word for it. It was, I call it early lash up. But it was a very powerful microwave radar, like all radar is a microwave. And it was being experimented with for the Navy so they could use it out to sea with a very powerful radar to pick up other ships on the horizon. If we could go back to that slide real quick, I apologize. It's interesting, there was a manual in there, and part of that manual warns the operators of this new powerful radar Now keep in mind that was restricted airspace back then. But before you run the new lash-up radar, make sure with your height finders and range finders there are no aircraft in the area, or serious damage or death could occur. It would be like the old radar ranges where you put an aluminum foil plate in it. I don't know if I subscribe to that as to what brought the Aztec UFO down, but it was interesting. Bill Steinman's theory did prove true because of the warning that we found in there. Next slide, please. We're going to sort of throw up an overhead and then talk about how it relates to this. As we moved on with, in looking into the story of Dr. G, he talked about other very influential and very important scientists of the day working on the project. In the late 90s, I was contacted by Glenn Pace from Nashville, Tennessee. That's not Glenn in the picture, that's Otto Kraus, a German scientist who defected here during World War II, not to be confused with the paperclip scientists that came after the war. Glenn Pace worked, ironically, he was born and raised in Farmington, New Mexico, 17 miles away from Aztec, and in the 50s and 60s worked at White Sands Missile Range, now White Sands Proving Ground, and worked with Otto Kraus and worked on top secret projects down there. We have all Glenn's records. He's not pulling our leg. One night they were sitting around delayed working on a test, and Otto Kraus asked Glenn Pace, "So you're from Farmington?" Glenn said, "Yeah." "You ever hear about the Aztec Incident?" Glenn said, "Well, I was 9 years old when it happened. It sort of hit. It was a rumor, kind of faded away." Then Otto Kraus said, "Well, I worked on that recovery." And he told Glenn Pace some incredible details that Glenn shared with us that later on we put all the pieces of the puzzle together, and he was about 86% accurate what he told Glenn Pace back then. Next slide, please. We're going to move now into, in our research, it's tough to take 18 and a half years and move it into an hour and 15 minutes and leave time for questions and answers, so we're kind of just give you an overview of what we found over the years. One of the Aztec witnesses we found, and I hate to do this, I hate when I look at an overhead and somebody says name withheld, but this gentleman's career is, we have investigated it as best we can. I've shared his name and his credentials with his permission with other researchers, but until his death, I cannot go into who he is. So you got to take my word on this one, and I promise there's names attached to all the other ones. We were going through the old classified reports from the radar bases, and we found that some were going up to the 4602, but now and then good UFO reports were being copied down to a gentleman at another Air Force base. Make a very long story short, I contacted him. I had declassified most of his old Air Force wing, explained to him briefly on the phone that I was doing research which involved his Air Force wing, and I'd like to meet with him. So on one cold winter night, we met at a Radisson hotel, and I came in with all my documents and showed to him that I declassified most, or as many as I could. And we started talking about Aztec. And what he claimed, obviously, as you can see, was never at the site, but he said the whole crash recovery, which you would expect would happen, was very compartmentalized, and claimed approximately 200 people involved in the cleanup operation. He was based at Walker Field at the time. Walker Field was the former Roswell Army Air Base. By 1948, it was now the Walker Field. In our interview, the first interview, obviously not being at the site, but he reminded me, if you think you have the right area in mind, look for concrete footers, because when we cut the road in, I know there were delays because they had problems with the silt. Well, unbeknownst to him, we had already spent many, many years at the crash site, and yes, there is a concrete footer out there, which has never made any sense at all. We'll get into that toward the end here. But that gave him credibility, having never been at the crash site, but knowing it was delayed. He claimed the whole recovery took about 2 weeks. When I sit and talk with somebody like this, of course I'm interested and excited, but my wife will tell you sometimes it takes up to a year and a half of doing research on somebody that makes a claim like that. Randolph Air Force Base is the archives of all the personnel records, and that's a painstaking process if you've never gone through it. But he does have credibility. He's a very successful gentleman. I don't really think he has any reason to pull my leg. He said their security oath back then was 50 years. Obviously, we're well beyond that. And the only person he ever shared that story with was his wife before she passed away. So, having not been at the crash site, but being involved in the recovery, I put him in my 5-star basket. Next slide, please. Ken Farley was an interesting witness. Ken was pretty young at the time, around 20 years old. He was traveling from Durango, Colorado. He was visiting an aunt, and he was on his way to San Diego, as you can see. Try to give you the condensed version, got lots of overhead to go over. A friend of his was going to be in either Aztec or Cedar Hill. I would bet Aztec, because Cedar Hill's about 3 buildings. It's one of those towns that says, "Welcome to Cedar Hill" on both sides of the sign. It's pretty small. Ken was not from that area, so he knew virtually nobody. Ken contacted Randy Barnes because he saw his name in the paper, and we flew down in 2000. We flew into Phoenix. Ken lived in Bat Cave, Arizona. We drove down to northern Phoenix that day and did a long interview. He was dying at the time of our interview. Matter of fact, he made it almost 2 years to the date of the interview. He was in very advanced stages of emphysema. The item 5 was the problem I had with Ken. The story went along great, and all of a sudden he talks about 2 police officers at the crash site the day they got out there. And basically the story, if you were reading along, he and his friend saw the commotion going on Hart Canyon Road and decided to go out. I really had a problem with that, and no disrespect to San Juan County Sheriff's Department. If you've ever been out to the crash site today, if you had a problem and you called 911, yeah, you'd certainly get 1 police officer, but I highly doubt you'd get 2. Next slide, please. Well, then, 2003, we interviewed Doug Nolan. Again, I don't want you to think I'm the kiss of death, but every time we get to a witness, they've got 1 foot in the grave. He was 19 years old at the time. He has since passed away. Matter of fact, he passed away a couple months after we interviewed him. Doug Nolan got up that morning and was en route to Bill Ferguson, or as everybody in Aztec called him, Fergie. They were going down to Bloomfield and then eventually Blanco to check on some tanks that day. Got to Bill Ferguson's house, his boss. Fergie said, "Nope, I just got word there's a bad brush fire out on Hart Canyon Road. We must get out there quick. We have company drip tanks out there." They arrived at the scene. The fire, which wasn't even near the drip tanks, it was way up on top of the ridge. Met by other workers that told him that we got the fire under control. There's not much to burn, but you really have to see what's laying out on the western edge of the mesa. So Doug gave us some very good information, basically from his memory. He had had a number of strokes when we got to him, and that was August and September of 2003. He died December 7th of that year. But all of a sudden, Ken Farley's story starts to make sense. Doug supported the story of 2 law enforcement officers. Obviously, we don't tell anybody about the previous person we interviewed. We just let them talk. We don't seed the witnesses. And Doug talked about when they got out there that there was already a police officer from Cuba, New Mexico, and then 1 from the local area. Now, Doug gave us a couple of leads on who that would be. Suzanne and I, my wife, we're still working on that. We have 3 candidates. We pretty much identified the Cuba police officer because they only had 2, so it was pretty easy. I could even handle that one. Doug was able to identify just about everybody that day. I kind of made Doug do what we did with Doug Farley. Here's the mesa, draw what you saw. Doug put he and his friend on the western side of the mesa to get a different view of it and to stay away from the ranchers and oil field workers that were starting to accumulate. Doug sort of did the same thing. Of course, we're doing this by phone, so we have to do it in a picturesque sort of way, but Doug kind of told me who all was there, who showed up, and then there were 2 to 3 other individuals on the western side of the mesa that he didn't know who they were. That fit in great with Doug Farley, and it wasn't 2 to 3, it was 2. Next slide, please. Fred Reed was at the site after the object, whatever it was recovered. He and his group were sent there to clean up the crash site. Fred really never suspected a UFO. His group was used to going out and cleaning up crash sites of aircraft crashes. When we interviewed Fred's, by the way, passed away right after this interview. Nowadays, I don't call the prospective witnesses, I have my wife do it. Now, Fred was a great guy. He was the pillar of the Aztec community, did a lot of tax returns for the elderly, was happily retired. Talked to us, actually, as you can see, I'm getting ahead of the story, in 2000, he wrote Deborah Mayu, who's a very good reporter at the Daily Times, and said to Deborah, hey, I think I have something to add to this whole crash site. And went through the whole thing of cleaning it up. I talked to him for a number of hours. As a matter of fact, this is another case. I literally had the airline ticket in my hand to fly back to Albuquerque up to Aztec. And Leon Hathcock from the Aztec Library called and said, don't bother, he had a massive heart attack. I don't put any conspiracy theory to this. You're dealing with people that are getting up in years. It's just, you know, not to copy Stan Friedman, but to use his line, you're chasing the Undertaker in these cases. So Fred contacted the Daily Times, and I talked to him for quite a while. I'm in the process right now of getting his full records. He was previously, as I wrote in my briefings, previously with the OSS during World War II, stayed in the military. Until I have all his records, I just want to kind of, but I'm very happy so far with the credibility. Next slide, please. Just give you an idea of what the crash site looks like. Our Air Force intelligence officer and other people over the years talk about the road that has been cut through to the mesa that makes no sense at all. That's a view of the road. And it kind of comes to an abrupt stop, almost a cul-de-sac, and stops. That road doesn't show up on any USGS maps, so that just further adds to the mystery. Next slide, please. Note, well, that's not a good picture of the background, but it's very desolate out there. As you can see, about midsection of this is the mystery concrete slab right here. It's about 39 by 39 inches, 1 meter by 1 meter, anywhere from 8 to 9 inches thick. For years, the skeptics said it was a well cap. And if they knew anything about geology, that you don't put a well cap up on an area of bedrock when you go down the road down to the silt where there's plenty of rigs and drill through. We've had that looked at by everybody we can find out there over the years. It's not a well cap. To prove it, we drilled a hole through it. If it had been a well cap, we would have blown ourselves to kingdom come. And we took a core sample and some other pieces out of it that we're having evaluated. Next slide, please. Oh, by the way, the day we drilled the hole in it, there weren't any skeptics around, so unfortunately, the weather is taking its toll, as well as souvenir hunters on it. There's 7/8 and 3/4 inch rebar throughout the whole thing. Last August, Suzanne and I went down. We've taken the core sample, and it's being evaluated by really one of the world's leading concrete companies, engineering companies in the world. And the people in the lab aren't even aware of what they're evaluating, but what they're doing is a concrete age leach test. And what they're doing is bombarding it with water and ultraviolet throughout the core that we took. And they've donated so much lab time and money to us. I think we've eaten that up, and we're waiting for their next round of budget. But when we're done, or when they're done, we'll be able to age that slab to about 6 months. So if it fits in the time frame of Aztec, great. If it doesn't, we'll pitch it. We don't know why it's there. It's not a compressor stand. Next slide, please. As we started digging, I'm bouncing around a little bit. You got to follow the bouncing ball. But we've gone to, went to the Air Force, of course, went to the FBI. About 1952, when Frank Scully's book was really at its peak, the story came to a complete screeching halt. A writer by the name of J.P. Kahn had written an article claiming that Frank Scully's book was not credible because the one person, Silas Newton, that had brought the story to Frank Scully was in trouble here, right here in Denver, Colorado, excuse me, on a confidence charge, basically a con game. So we went digging for records on it. There's been some other research over the years that have done some great work in digging up the court records. We decided to keep digging and see what we could really find. The basic story on the street is, Aztecs, stay away from it. Frank Scully's sources were in trouble with the law. They can't be believed. Well, if you do a lot of digging on it, this is OSI, Air Force Office of Special Investigation. You can see on the last paragraph that we're convinced this whole matter is a hoax as far as the UFO story into the Silas Newton claim. Next slide, please. Can you put it back up? Oh, can I read it? I'm at a bad angle myself. Oh, there you go. It's just basically saying on November 29th, 1949, the OSI and FBI were aware of this claim going around about a flying disc. And it talks about Bruce Cabot had notified, I guess, OSI and the FBI. Bruce Cabot was the actor that hung around Frank Scully and Silas Newton. But basically, they're kind of writing it all off as a hoax. Next slide, please. This is another more or less supporting document that they're distributing out around everybody, saying that here's all the people that were involved. We're kind of following the story, but we don't think there's much to it. Hey, this goes on until 1971. Next slide, please. Some of these are very hard to make into an overhead. Matter of fact, these aren't even great, but I had to pick the best ones I could. That's page 2 of the letter. I'll give you a quick overview. As a matter of fact, I'll give you a website you can go to and look at these. But basically, in '49, even before Scully's book has come out, the OSI, Office of Special Investigation of the Air Force, and the FBI are both doing a joint investigation. It turns out when the FBI writes the OSI and says, hey, we're hearing rumblings about a crashed UFO, are you guys in the loop on this? OSI comes back and says, yeah, it's a hoax, don't worry about it. We're already in the loop. Next slide, please. Basically, it tells the FBI, just back off and stay out of it. They're having trouble with some of these documents. They're not easy to read. Now we're up to 1950, and the blacked out name where the X is Mr. Newton. He alleges he has a debris or souvenirs from the Aztec crash given to him by this mysterious Dr. G. The blacked out name again is Bruce Cabot. They sent me another document. You can't read anything but Bruce Cabot's name, so you can put 2 and 2 together. Next document, please. We're going to kind of, again, we're going to go through the fall of the bouncing ball. Now the FBI gets a little upset with OSI. They don't like to be told to stay out of anything. And kind of, I think, what this country had prior to 9/11, not making a joke, but I think everybody's so compartmentalized and everybody's worried about their turf. This is a letter saying that, basically read the following page. Next slide, please, about a report we have. Now this page, this is headquarters, United States Air Force. Oh, by the way, the OSI tells the FBI, do not share this information with Kirkland, the 8th Air Force, or the 34th Air Group. Keep everything coming here to Washington. Not that we're following it, but if you stumble on any more documents, bring them to us. Now they're worried about a claim, and again, a lot of this centers right around Denver, Colorado here. This one is OSI following a report that they got from 2 sources. One is the 5th Army Group, that somebody is trying to sell pictures of the Aztec UFO crash at the Merlin Bar here in up north a little bit in downtown Denver, at the Edelweiss Bar. And turns out, did a little research, it was a reporter from the Baltimore Sun. Came all the way out here, offered $1,500 per picture. We could raise that up just a little bit. I don't know if you can read that. Last item. They're getting a little worried here. The regional office commented that in spite of his denials, his manner indicated that he had It's interesting wording that it looks like they're worried that he may have a picture of it. Next slide, please. So now we got the OSI, the FBI. Now we're bringing in the 5th Army Group. That's just supporting documents of who signed it. Next slide, please. Now the FBI files on Silas Newton start in 1939, long before Aztec, on something else. I don't know if it was the J. Edgar Hoover conspiracy theory that they were looking at everybody in Hollywood. That file they won't release to me. This is basically 1949 and up. If we could go to the next slide. What we're trying to establish here is if the Aztec crash didn't happen, I told you we couldn't put everything on there. This is 1 week of declassified documents. All this for a con game that went from federal court to the civil court. If we go back to that, now we have the FBI on a witch hunt. They want Silas Newton and his sidekick Leo Getbauer in a bad way. Next slide, please. Again, I can tell you where to go online here at the end. You can read these, if they're even tough to read. Where I have that highlighted, the FBI now internally is saying, hey guys, this con game, after we look into it, Silas Newton, like most oil drillers and researchers or speculators, normally got 33 people together and said, everybody put in $10,000. That gives us $330,000. We drill a hole, we find oil, you get instant payback. We drill the second hole, we keep drilling till we run out of money. Out of 33 investors in this, one of them complained to the FBI that he thought he had been taken because in the pitch from Silas Newton to his investor, he and Getbauer did make a mistake. It ruined their credibility. They claimed that you really need to invest with us because we've got some alien technology to help us. We've got this doodle bug from a UFO that crashed in Aztec. in that document, if we can go back to it, they are greatly concerned that they have a weak case against Newton. Next slide, please. Basically, what happens is a federal judge says, this is another internal memo, weak case again. The FBI was trying to get him for transportation of ill-gotten goods across state line, basically by cashing the investor's check and putting it in his account in California. The FBI was going for that. The judge said, no. You have 33 people, you have one guy complaining, I'm moving this to civil court, you settle your differences. At this point, the FBI is trying to depose the other investors, and after they do, they find out that they don't have an axe to grind with Silas Newton. So they're telling the FBI, we don't have an axe to grind. We've been successful in the past on some of these oil ventures. Well, the FBI turns around and says, okay, we're exempting these 32 people from testimony. Anybody that's been through the court system will know that's a little twist. Next slide, please. They're getting upset now. Look at all the people that receive the CCs on this. We've got Denver, Albuquerque, Butte, I believe Dallas, Omaha, Phoenix, Springfield, Missouri, Denver, Colorado, Los Angeles. Now, again, keep in mind, over a civil case, we're now up to 1952. Why is the FBI and the OSI on a witch hunt for Silas Newton and Leo Getbauer? Of course, I'm speculating now. Did they have knowledge, more knowledge than we know today, of who Dr. G was and what really happened in Aztec in 1948? Next slide, please. I put that up for Stan Friedman. I give this to Stan for his collection. There's a lot of those in here. They give you what, maybe 1% of the document you can read. Why would they even send that to me? I think there might be one more slide we want to look at. This is just another one that bounced around. They're all getting upset their witch hunt isn't working too well. And it's, again, another federal judge shooting back to them. We're going between Denver and Los Angeles and federal judges to try to decide who can try the case. And it's coming back, but you guys don't have a federal case. If you want to move it to federal civil, fine. They were found guilty, and I don't want to say guilty. They were found wrong in their civil case, and I believe they were forced to pay back $18,000 to their investor. When you hear the skeptics tell the story, again, they were bad guys, got in trouble with the FBI, end of story, that's it. They don't tell you about how the case turned out. They also don't tell you that the Langley oil fields just here in Southern California ended up being some of the most unbelievable oil fields. So Silas Newton, aside from trying to sell alien technology to his investors, did know something as far as an oil speculator. If there is one more slide. That's it? Okay, we'll go to some other things here. I guess we have to give the skeptics their time in this because I am a researcher. We have to give equal time to everybody. In my briefings, I wrote some, I took the best of the best skeptics, if there is such a thing, in Aztec. Over the years, even before my involvement, we'll just go through some of the top claims of the Hart Canyon and Aztec skeptics. The one you hear all the time, or you don't anymore, but you heard all the time. Hart Canyon Road did not exist in 1948, therefore the Aztec crash could not have happened. Our response from doing research, the last stagecoach robbery in San Juan County took place on Hart Canyon Road. That wasn't hard to find. The source for us, the Farmington Daily Times. We didn't even have to go back and archive the original article. They did a historical article in '89 and wrote up about famous things that happened on Hart Canyon Road. I got to pick on this skeptic for a minute. He lives in Albuquerque, works on Yale Road, which is coming out of the airport. I took my rental car and I backed it into next to his car and I zeroed my odometer. Came out of his workplace, made a left on Yale, went down to Central Avenue, made a right, and went to a store that I love. Anybody that loves the Southwest would be familiar with Cowboys and Indians. It's a great antique store. And in there, within 5 minutes, I found original Rand, not Rand McNally now, Rand before the merger, from 1890 and 1900, and the maps of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado specifically show Hart Canyon Road. Now, this guy's a scientist. It was 1.5 miles from his workplace we found the maps. Skeptic number 2, the Aztec crash could have never happened because we never found the radar bases. I think we went over that pretty well. We found the bases. Matter of fact, he was still saying that after we declassified him, but that's okay. Another skeptical thing you hear over the years, the Aztec crash has never yielded one witness in over 50 years. This skeptic lives 2.5 hours from Aztec, never once has gotten in his car and spent any time in Aztec. He gets all his information off the internet. That's a good, credible place. I've recently been attacked since last August when Dwight Conley published my article in the MUFON Journal. Both Ken Farley and Doug Nolan were dying at the time of my interview. Therefore, they were delusional and not good witnesses. Well, they were certainly in bad health, but Ken Farley was on oxygen at the time, and his kids were very concerned with his health, but they allowed him to drive from Bat Cave, Arizona to Phoenix, which is about an hour drive, and back. I really don't think, knowing how protective Ken Farley's kids were, if they were worried about him being delusional, would let him get behind the wheel of a car. Yeah, Doug Nolan was dying. His speech was slow, but he was certainly a credible guy. He, like anybody after 6 strokes, just sort of talked very slow. This is a good one. This has been floating around for years. The Aztec Incident was no more than a P-38. That was a fighter-bomber escort plane in World War II that ran low on fuel and landed on Highway 550 north of the entrance of Hart Canyon Road. By the way, if you ever got in trouble in an aircraft, it's a perfect natural runway. The P-38 sat alongside the road for 10 to 14 days before the military arrived with flatbed trucks, disassembled the P-38, and hauled the craft away. That took no research. But we have to answer the skeptics. Well, first of all, the P-38, if it would have landed exactly and been parked exactly where the skeptic claims, it was 28 miles from the Durango airport. It would have been 24.5 miles from the Farmington airport. If a P-38 were to run low on fuel, he would have had 2 perfect airports to line up with and dead stick land into instead of picking Highway 550. But with that said, we hauled back down to Maxwell Air Force Base, pulled up all the incident reports, and first we have a few problems. It was a bomber escort plane, but probably not in service in 1948, unless it was in a reserve unit, which to this date we haven't found any reserve units that had a P-38. This is not a plane you'd want in your reserve unit anyway, if you remember what a P-38 was. The other thing is a fully loaded P-38, I got this from Lockheed, would be, and this is loaded with bombs and fuel, would be 21,400 pounds at that altitude. Would require about 2,300 feet of runway. Let's double that. Let's say 4,000 feet. The road, the Highway 550, unobstructed is 12,000 feet. That's just over 2 miles. So the pilot would have had plenty of, margin of 2.25, 2.5 times to refuel the plane and take it back off. Not bring in flatbed trucks and disassemble it. How stupid is that? By the way, the next year, the P-38s were scrapped down in Tucson, Arizona. The skeptic then changed his tune. Oh, it was a T-34 trainer. Well, that's even better, because that would have required 2 phenomena. One would be time travel, because the T-34 didn't come out till 1950. We don't even know if there were any in service in 1950. A friend of mine in Dallas has one, a fully restored one. So he was a good source to go to. They just did a 3-year restoration on it. Now, a T-34 is even easier to dead stick land, easier to go get fuel. You would have had an instructor on board. You would have had a rookie pilot, assuming it was a training mission, but you couldn't have been in 1948 if it didn't come in until 1950. It only requires fully loaded of fuel 500 feet of runway. Now, even an instructor after an incident like this would have had 20 times the required runway to take off. Again, I'm just picking up the highlights of the skeptics over the years. Obviously, local residents I talked to out there, and in Cedar Hill, it's pretty sparse, so there's not that many, but nobody remembers an aircraft landing out there. That would have been big news. Some of the people I talked to that are adults now said, hey, we would have been kids back then. We would have played on it if it sat out here. So basically, we're trying to do this very analytically and doing it with a lot of thought. But so far as we go through the claims that were made back then, we don't find really any fault in Frank Scully's original book. We find fault in the people that have attacked it over the years. Of course, there's always the question, the craft, according to the description by Dr. G, just to go back sort of to the crash site for a few minutes, would have been 100 feet in diameter and was virtually intact. And it contained about 14 to 16 bodies. The other thing I didn't put up there, Ken Farley described something on the craft that I made a journal in my notes as we were interviewing him. It was the last thing he told me, and I was still my head was spinning over the 2 police officers. When we interviewed Doug Nolan by phone, I asked him, did you see any unusual things on the craft itself other than the obvious, lightweight metal when you knocked on it, no seams, no rivets, no welding marks, no bolts, no nuts? And he talked about a small insignia type of thing, which matched not Ken Farley 90%, it matched it 100%. So I guess I got to look at our witnesses. If they're pulling our leg, they really did a good job at it. And then you have to look at motive and say, well, why would they do this? I don't know what goes through people's minds when they're at the last few years of their life, but certainly these people had what I felt some credible things. We've talked to people that weren't so credible over the years too. And I don't mean that in a way that they were trying to mislead us, but in a way that, they contact us and have this great part of the Aztec history. But when we get there, it's usually not firsthand. It's my uncle went fishing with a guy that claimed he was there, and you got to kind of sort through those and take the good with the bad. But it's a lot of tedious work. The next thing we're working on right now, if you read my paper I submitted here, and I don't have time to go into it today because we don't have all the overheads done of the facts behind what we mentioned in there. But now the real question is, who was Dr. G leaking all this information to Frank Scully? Somebody that was very much in the government circles or high up in what I would call the loop was leaking some incredibly important things. One of the claims he makes in his book, and Frank Scully's book, a direct quote from Dr. G, is they were the magnetic scientists of the world that had worked on many top secret projects in World War II. And in one day, one of their devices took out 17 Japanese subs. Now, that's a pretty stout claim to make in 1949, 1950. However, we learned a few months ago that claim is true. And it was a company that, if you thought you had to follow the bouncing ball before, this one really gets crazy. But it turns out it was GSI, Geophysical Sciences Incorporated. And they were based on a military base out in New York. They employed the type of people that are described in Frank Scully's book, kind of really throw a spin on you. That company later became Texas Instruments. And so you've got GSI, a contractor during World War II. Later, the two founders move it out of New York, and if you follow all the corporate paperwork, it is what we have today as Texas Instruments. And now we're picking apart all the people that worked at GSI at that time, and I've been working with a researcher on the West Coast, Frank Warren, who a lot of researchers are familiar with. Frank's been around a long time, a fantastic researcher, and he's come up with a lot of good things on who those players would have been. So at this point, there's enough there to tell us to keep going. We don't have a smoking gun. We don't have any hard evidence, any hardware. But it's certainly, for a story that's laid around, had a black eye for a number of years, there is certainly something to this story. And we're going to continue to keep marching forward and look at it. I've got a few minutes left. If anybody has any questions, I think there's a microphone. You can come up and direct any questions.
What did the insignia look like on the ship?
I'm not going to divulge that. I'm using that in my hip pocket for other people down the road. And possibly by the time Suzanne and I get our book done, we'll put that in there. The question was, the young lady asked, what was the insignia that the two men at the crash site had described? And I said I'd like to kind of keep that in my hip pocket because there are other people potentially that are still alive. We're trying to find a guy right now that, as of a few months ago, he's still collecting a Social Security check. So let's hope he can add some light on that. By the time the book comes out, we'll put that in there. Yes, sir. I don't think your mic's on. Try that.
Well, I don't know how to operate it.
Should have a little slide on off right here. There you go.
It works.
There you go.
I was wondering if you could tell us more about this device that supposedly took out, what did you say, 17 Japanese submarines? I don't understand how that could work.
Well, what they were magnetic buoys that they would drop in the water. It would be like today's GPS system, where they could put a triangulated 3 magnetic submersible buoys. I'll give you an internet site you can look at and read about it. And that way, as the metallic submarines came into that area, it would give a triangulated position where they could find them. Yes, sir.
Yes, I read Wendell Stevens' book, Crash in Aztec, New Mexico. And how is it different, or is there anything that he left out in his book that you found in your research?
I think one of the things, and I've talked to Wendell and Bill Steinman. I came forward about a year and a half ago, and we talked for a while. He's disappeared again. I think one thing we've done is we've taken where he uses initials in his book and actually attached the name to it. When Bill Steinman did his research, and that was completely independent because Bill just, like I said, in a year and a half made contact. That would be one thing. Bill had never found the radar bases. He was running out of time and money at the time that they were coming to closure on the book. I think the collection, you have to read Frank Scully's book first and then pick up a copy of UFO Crash at Aztec. The problem with UFO Crash at Aztec, it's that thick and about that much applies to Aztec.
Right, it was like a Bible.
Yeah. So after you kind of get done, then Wendell just puts in there other supporting information about ufology to kind of give the book legs to stand on and some credibility.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that this craft may have been as big as 100 feet in diameter. Do you have any evidence of how they may have actually moved or broken up this craft to move it?
No, and nothing more than what Frank Scully talks about in his book. They said the craft came apart. I haven't even researched into that. My whole thing, my whole research is based on did a craft land or crash on the mesa. A lot of people sometimes criticize me, well, you don't seem to care if there were bodies on board. Well, whether there was 1 or 16, it doesn't matter, and how they got out of there. If it didn't come apart, I'll be the first to admit that would be a task, getting it out of there. 100 feet in diameter is a big object. Yes, sir.
Didn't they find some kind of metal stands at the crash site that they might have lifted the craft up and set them on?
Bill Steinman did, yes. He even has pictures in his book of them. And very few things have disappeared off the crash site over the years. I know I spent many, many, many hours out there. Those did disappear right when his book came out. But yeah, there were metal stands, the gentleman's question, as though somebody was trying to erect something or hold it up in the air. He at least documented it with pictures, but I have not seen them.
Did the craft truly crash with great impact, or did it soft land?
From all indications that I've talked to witnesses, there was really, the word crash should be removed.
Okay.
It was virtually intact.
Well, if it was a soft land, I would think that the beings would still be alive rather than dead.
All indications, and talking, Doug Nolan actually looked in the window. Ken Farley, I don't know. I got to reread my notes on that. Doug Nolan saw 2 when he looked through the portholes and said they looked browned or burnt. And I think that's where the radar theory that I haven't really subscribed to 100% is a theory that maybe they were fried in some type of radar.
Radiation.
I think that is purely speculation. I like to go on hardcore black and white.
Right. All right, thank you.
You bet.
What is the website you keep referring to?
Which one for the document?
No, you said more than once about a website, and I don't remember you giving a website.
Okay, we have a website if you want to look at these documents a little bit better. Or we have a website, too, that you can go to buy a copy of the documentary that was just done that Tracy mentioned before. The documentary website, and the proceeds of this tape after publishing costs do go to the Aztec Public Library, which, good news, they are building a new library. 5 or 8 years of hard work, we've raised some money anyway. The one website is www.aztec1948.com. And if you want to view these records on Silas Newton, some of which we declassified, some the FBI already had on the web, that would be www.fbi.gov.com. Go to their Freedom of Information Act, then click on Reading Room, click on alphabetical order. It's really user-friendly to go to. And you'll see everybody that J. Edgar Hoover was on a witch hunt with over the years. And you'll scroll down, you'll find Silas Newton. They've just added a bunch of these documents to it. Any other questions? We do have the tape, the DVD on sale today. My wife, Suzanne, is running the booth. If you have any interest, Red Star Film did a very good documentary on it, Paul Kimball. Paul is a very talented individual. He's done 3 documentaries. He did the first one, a biography on Stan Friedman. Stanton Friedman is real. It's a great biography on Stan. He did the Majestic 12 documents, and he last year completed the UFO Aztec 1948 documentary. This year it won 2 EVE awards at Laughlin, so my hat's off to Paul Kimball and his crew. They really did a good job. If that's it, I just want to warn Stan Friedman of one thing. I see they're auctioning off Stanton for lunch. They did that to me once at Aztec. The Aztec board came up to me and said, hey, you're a nice guy, you're single, you've never been married, we'd like to auction you off to raise money. I agreed to that. They sold me for $1 a ticket. When it was all said and done, we averaged out how many tickets were sold and what the cost was. I went for 79 cents a pound. I don't think you could buy Spam for that much. But now here's the interesting twist. Suzanne Ninos won the winning lottery ticket, or whatever ticket, and we were married 8 months from that day. I don't mean there's a warning in there somewhere for Stan. It was the best raffle I was ever in, and obviously it will be the last raffle I'll ever in. So with that, you've been a great audience. Thank you so much, and I thank MUFON and everybody for having me.